Thank you so much, Alessandra, for that introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, best greetings from Krems in Austria. And thank you all so much for joining us for this final conference of our project on cultural heritage protection. A topic that is very dear to me personally, as are preparedness strategies and evacuation plans for safeguarding cultural heritage at risk. To be honest, the topic and title of my presentation today sound a bit challenging and hint at something very complicated. But I would say it is actually very easy to prepare cultural heritage for safeguarding. It actually becomes easy at the very moment we realize that we have to prepare, that we have to make plans, that we have to think the unthinkable. Next slide. Two years ago, who would have thought that in April 2019, the world-famous Cathedral of Notre in Paris would be engulfed in flames? It was unthinkable, and the whole world watched the development. The world was shocked and hoped that the firefighters would succeed and that the world-famous monument could be saved. French authorities had thought the unthinkable, and they were prepared. Emergency plans for Notre Dame existed. They had been tested and exercised before and were put into action that very day. And thus 90% of Notre Dame's movable cultural heritage could be saved. In order to safeguard cultural heritage at risk and to be prepared, we are challenged. We are challenged to think the unthinkable. Next slide. During the last 3 years in ProteCHt2save, we focused on movable and immovable heritage, threatened by climate change-induced natural catastrophes, fire due to drought, heavy rain, and flood. We focused on developing cost-efficient and feasible strategies and plans for safeguarding cultural heritage and enabling proactive preparedness. Next slide. In order to hinder a river, in this case, the River Danube, to flood and overwhelm a museum, we have to prepare. We have to prepare and plan, but first of all, we have to realize that we have to prepare and that we have to plan. Next slide. Why do we prepare and plan? We plan for incidents that are unmanageable with everyday means. We prepare for the worst, the unimaginable, the unthinkable. We develop at least a plan A and a plan B, and we contact and get to know supporters, assistants before we need them. And then we teach, train, and educate. Next slide. In the disaster management cycle, the incident, the catastrophe happening is on the very top of the slide you see on your screens. We prepare before the catastrophe strikes, and we respond immediately after the catastrophe took place. And these are the two phases we tackle with our preparedness strategies and evacuation plans: preparedness phase and response phase. Put very simply, everything that we prepare for before a catastrophe strikes is likely to work in one way or the other in the response phase. And that is why we do it. That is why we make plans, we win time, and we contribute to success. Success in safeguarding cultural heritage at risk, and thus safeguarding our history, our future, and our identity. Next slide. In ProteCHt2save, we have based our transnational strategy for safeguarding cultural heritage at risk on the 2007 UNESCO strategy for reducing risks from disasters at World Heritage properties. All the 6 points listed here were tackled within the project, and all of them are of immediate importance. To strengthen institutional support and governance for reducing risks at cultural heritage sites. To use knowledge, innovation, and education to build a culture of disaster prevention. To identify, assess, and monitor risks from disasters at heritage sites. to reduce risk factors at heritage sites, to strengthen disaster preparedness at heritage sites, and to strengthen the capacity to build back better and integrate intangible heritage into risk management strategies. Point 5, strengthen disaster preparedness at heritage sites is the one most critical for us today. As I've already mentioned at the beginning, it is very easy to prepare the moment we have realized that we need to prepare and think the unthinkable. Think things we hope will never come true. But it pays off to be prepared for the worst. From the transnational approach, the parenthesis for heritage protection in the partner countries and in Central Europe, we went into detail down to the local and regional levels and developed a blueprint emergency plan and suggested concrete measures that were adopted in the 7 pilot sites in ProteCHt2save. We will hear more about the pilot sites and pilot actions in the next presentation. Next slide. At the beginning of every preparedness and emergency plan is a sound risk assessment, which puts the type of cultural heritage in question in relation to the threats it might be exposed to. These threats include fire, flood, theft, vandalism, climate change, light, earthquakes, violence, severe weather conditions, and so on. The threats obviously differ and depend on the geographical location of the cultural heritage in question and the type of cultural heritage itself. A stone monument is obviously differently affected from fire than a painting in a museum, for example. Next slide. If we put the identified threats in relation to the likelihood of their appearance and the size of their impact, we get a risk matrix, as you see on the screen. Threats that are not very likely to occur and furthermore have an insignificant impact range in the green zone, whereas threats that are likely to occur and have a severe impact are found in the red zone. In our example, which is taken from the medieval town of Kremsstein on the Danube, fire and flood are possible, but the threat is severe, thus we get the red marker. Earthquakes have a rare likelihood, but would also have a major impact, thus we result in an orange marker. And vandalism is rare to occur and has a minor impact, thus we get green for this particular threat. The risk assessment, as you see it very simplified on the screens, is the basis for all plans developed. Thus, it needs to be undertaken carefully. It definitely takes time to produce a sound basis to work with, because every plan, emergency plan, will be built on this risk assessment. And after having identified the highest risk for our cultural heritage, we can take the next step on the next slide. We can start figuring out the internal responsibilities connected to the cultural heritage in question. During a catastrophic situation, there is no time to try to figure out who is in charge, who is the emergency coordinator, who has which responsibilities. These issues have to be identified well beforehand, and ideally, the emergency coordinator gets the chance to test the developed plans during a training exercise, also well before the plans are needed for real. It is also highly recommendable to define an emergency coordinator who holds a high place in the internal hierarchy. This usually helps to implement the developed measures, and it also puts the needed emphasis on the topic cultural heritage protection. On the next slide, we see the next step, the emergency plan itself. On the screen, you have some bullet points that highlight the most important parts of an emergency plan. You figure out the internal contact details, private mobile numbers of your collaborators. What's the chain of alert? Who's calling whom in an emergency? You gather contact details of external experts, institutions, whoever might be of assistance to you in a case of emergency. And you define and label priorities. Why priorities? Let's imagine a museum with 200 paintings. If it burns and the firefighters only have a restricted time frame for recovering paintings, we would like them to recover the 20 most important paintings for the museum and not 20 randomly chosen paintings. If we prioritize beforehand and the firefighters get the chance to exercise beforehand, it is likely that the 20 most important paintings are saved. Even if we would like to save all of the paintings, of course, but if the time span is very limited, let us start with the 20 most important ones. That is why we define priorities. And I know very well that defining priorities is not easy, and it actually might be the hardest task in the whole process of preparing and planning. The next step is preparation for an evacuation. Prepare route cards, temporary storage areas, and packaging materials. On the next slide, we see an example for a route card. Basically, this is a map to the high priority items in a museum or a collection. On the one side, on the right-hand side, you see an overview map detailing a room in which the objects in question are in. On the other side, you see a picture of the whole room. This shows you where in the room the objects are located. We do not need artistic details in these route cards. It's the overview of the location that counts. The second picture on that side gives you the details of the objects in question. In this case, 2 Baroque putti, which have a 3-star priority, which in our case is the highest priority you could get in that museum. And the information further down on that page tells us what we need to know for the evacuation. In this case, we need more than one person evacuating the putti, not just because there are 2, but they are on display under a heavy glass vitrine that needs to be moved first. So basically, these route cards are treasure maps for the recovery of cultural heritage, and they should be prepared. Next slide. What you see here in the picture is a temporary storage area in Città Ducale in Italy, where the cultural heritage recovered after the earthquake that was already mentioned in 2016 from Accumuli was brought to and is still stored there. Besides being brilliantly organized, the depot in Città Ducale is also a brilliant example for one of the most important, but usually extremely underrated topics in cultural heritage protection: security against looting. Looting is something that we tend to connect with war zones and the destruction of cultural heritage in Syria or Mali, but not with Central Europe and not with natural catastrophes. But it is mandatory to think about securing the salvaged objects. They usually hold an enormous value, be it monetary value or be it identity. In this case, the temporary storage area was set up in a carabinieri barrack, thus being amply protected by the nature of the location. And this drives home the lesson that we always have to keep in mind when dealing with cultural heritage is security of ourselves and of the cultural heritage we recover and deal with. Next slide. Packaging material. That's something we can prepare easily as well. Either it's for packing objects that need to be moved in the case of emergency, or as in this case, to protect a non-movable item from further damage, from rain or from soot. And pictures like this one on the screen right now bring us to the next important topic: training. Cultural heritage teams, which have already been mentioned today. On the next slide. The cultural heritage rescue teams developed in ProteCHt2save are based on the Italian role model of the Carabinieri for the protection of cultural heritage and the Unite for Heritage initiative. And these teams combine a number of skills and expertise necessary for protecting and recovering cultural heritage affected by any type of calamity. The huge benefit of predefined cultural heritage rescue teams is that they get the chance to train together, to practice, and also to test developed emergency plans. When cooperating and training together with emergency responders, they also establish interfaces that are most important to deal with any cultural heritage that is under threat. On the next slide. we see a firefighting exercise in which cultural heritage protection played a central role. Whereas on the next slide, we see the evacuation, the recovery of archival material, which is damaged by water for further treatment by specialists. And both pictures were taken during training exercises in which cultural heritage experts trained together with emergency responders in the framework of ProteCHt2save with firefighters, civil protection, armed forces, and both sides, the heritage and the emergency responder side, learned a great deal from each other and established the interfaces they would need to safeguard cultural heritage the moment the need arose. And the emergency plans developed in ProteCHt2save and adapted to the 7 pilot sites were built on training exercises like these, and thus had a huge benefit from the very start of being tested under duress already. And from these exercises, we distilled a number of lessons identified to be seen on the next slide. Preparing, planning, and training for cultural heritage protection, we always keep in mind that human lives come first, full stop. We do not move cultural heritage unless it is really compelling and only if the objects are safer at the new location. And we take care of our own safety when recovering cultural heritage. We define interfaces wherever possible, and we raise awareness. And raising awareness is the topic on which I would like to end this presentation. If we are not aware of the necessity to prepare, then we have lost already. Next slide. In order to raise the general awareness for the necessity of cultural heritage protection and to give heritage experts and emergency responders the possibility to prepare and to train off-site, we have developed an interactive handbook on best practices in cultural heritage protection, the mobile game Vltava Rising. The scenario is set in Prague. The Vltava River is going to flood, and an international team of experts, a cultural heritage rescue team, has about 72 hours to assess the threats, plan for an evacuation, and recover the objects in a museum threatened by the flood. The application should be available for download next weekend, free of charge, of course. So join us, prepare, plan, and train with us for the safeguarding of cultural heritage at risk. Thank you.